Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second lecture on the history of English language and literature. In the first introductory series, we saw that development of English through ages, and we also noticed that what had been happening in the Anglo-Saxon period at the turn of event which led to the emergence of Middle English period. We also saw that though the Middle English period was quite eventful to begin with, the most noted name during this period was Chaucer, so much so that even an age was named as Age of Chaucer. Many historians, as we also mentioned in the beginning, they consider Chaucer a real starting point of English literature. Chaucer lived from 1342 only till 1400. However, the entire century gets named after his massive figure, Geoffrey Chaucer. He was described as the first of our really national poets, and he was also considered and continues to be considered as father of English poetry. So when we look at the opening moments of English literature, it is very important to also understand the time period which Chaucer's life and time covered in terms of social history and the political history of the period. So in that sense, we begin to see that Chaucer had the rare distinction of having lived under three monarchs, three kings. He was born in 1340 during the reign of Edward III, and it was during his lifetime that Richard II succeeded, that was in 1377. He also witnessed two major events: the Revolution of 1399, including the deposition of Richard II, and also the foundation of the Lancastrian dynasty. And he dies in 1400, 1 year after the ascension of Henry IV. So this is a very brief introduction towards the life of Chaucer in terms of social and political history. And moving on, if we look into a bit detail into the life of Geoffrey Chaucer, he also belonged to the Middle English period and was rightfully known as the morning star of the Renaissance. He was born in London. He was born into a fairly well-to-do family, rich family. We know very little about his childhood. Most of the details are not available, but however, we get to know that he was the son of merchant Winter, a wine merchant, and he lived a fairly luxurious life to begin with. And historians do assume that he also enjoyed the advantages of liberal education, and so much so that the contact that he made at very young age were quite significant to begin with. So right at the age of 17, he had his first court appointment, and he was a page to the wife of the Duke of Clarence, who was also Edward III's son. And we find that by 1359, he also lives with the English army during one of their wars with France, and he was even taken prisoner during that period. But we find that Edward III, he was too kind and generous towards Chaucer that he chose to ransom him with 16 pounds. 16 pounds was a huge sum in 14th century. If we compare it with the buying power of 14th century, historians do calculate that a single pound was enough to sustain an ordinary man for about 6 months. That means half a year. So 16 pound was a huge sum of money, and that money was paid to bring back Chaucer as ransom. So we can even understand the kind of influence and the kind of life that he led, so much so that even the king did care to bring him back as ransom. He was married too, but we do not have too many details of his domestic life, personal life. Historians have not recorded it because many of the things are not available. And he also continued to be closely connected with the court, and he was often sent on diplomatic mission to France to Italy. So his exposure was also quite varied. He had rather a luxurious courtly life, and he was sent an ambassador to different parts of the country, different parts of the world as well. So he got to travel a lot. Then exposure really made Chaucer into the man that he was. So rightfully he was the appropriate person to begin the story of English literature with. That he had the fine measure of good exposure. He had a way in which he could articulate everything into good writings, and so his writings are considered as the beginning of English literature. English literature itself. And there were ups and downs in Chaucer's life. We have already seen how he was sent to Italy in diplomatic mission because he was considered as a fine ambassador to negotiate with the leaders of other provinces and other countries. And he was very much influenced by the Italian culture and early Renaissance. As we know, it had its early beginnings in the land of Italy. And some historians even feel that he may have met Petrarch and Boccaccio, the leading literary writers of the period. And also he was the recipient of many royal favors, and it is said that he even sat in the parliament as a knight of the Shire of Kent. And there was brief time when his life went through a major crisis, that was period when the house of Lancasterians were overthrown from power. And we do see that point of the time John of Gaunt, who was a major patron of Chaucer, he was banished from court for a brief period, and that time Chaucer fell into poverty, and he saw very difficult times during the period as well. So he even thought that he might end his life in poverty as well as, but again the turns of events, thanks to the state of flux in which the political and social life of England was, again we find the Lancasterians coming back to power with accession of Henry IV, who also happens to be one of John Gaunt's sons. And with that we find that Chaucer gets very generous grant of royal pension. And there is an assumption that perhaps he looked forward to very comfortable life ahead. He even leased out a really big apartment in the center of the nation. But we do find that life had other plans for him, and he dies within a year of accession of King Henry IV. So this is very brief summary of Chaucer's life and how his life was closely connected with the social and political terms of events. And also one important note as far as English, the history of English literary is concerned, he was the first poet to buried in Westminster Abbey, a very prestigious place, and the place in which he is buried is now known as Poets' Corner, and it is also much favored site for the tourists as well. It is very important to see how Chaucer's England was fashioned so that it influenced his writings, and so much that an entire period came to be known as the Age of Chaucer as well. So social historians also prefer to call this period as Chaucer's England because it continued to influence ways in which the writing of the period was produced, and also it influenced the way in which English literature and the general English language was beginning to get fashioned. So we also saw in the introductory session about how in this Middle English period after the Norman conquest, England began to emerge as a distinct nation. There was an increased sense of nationalism, a sense of nationhood. They began to emerge more with native influences rather than with the foreign, Italian or French influences. So we also find a standardization of English language. If you remember, it was Chaucer's language and King Alfred's language, the East Midland dialect, which emerged as the standard English, which continued to be used even in the contemporary. And also we find that it was not merely English which was used in Chaucer's England, The clergy continued to use Latin, which was language of ecclesiastical power, and these courtiers continued to use French language as well. French for a long term, in fact, continued to be language of the royalty, and it was also used in some measures in law courts until a statute law, which came to be issued, directed that English should completely replace the usage of French. And in this period, the Middle English period, Chaucer's England, especially 14th century, was dominated by the Roman Catholic Christianity. The clergy enjoyed a lot of power, and we also find a certain kind of revival happening within Christianity in England. A little bit of that we will be seeing in detail shortly. And there is expansion of trade as Britain consolidates itself as a nation and also understands the possibility of expanding itself in terms of land, in terms of trade, so on, so forth. And during this period, thanks to the connection with Italy, the influences of Renaissance, from there we also find that there is renewed interest in the literature of classical antiquity, especially literature in Greek and Rome. And there is also this influence of humanism, which is connected to the emergence of Renaissance. And we find that there is a free secular spirit, a spirit of inquiry, which is beginning to emerge that qualifies much of the writing and thought of the later period in England. And it is during this period that Oxford emerges as an intellectual center, and we do see John Wycliffe's major influence, major contribution in shaping Oxford into the intellectual center that is today. And it was only a little later, by the 15th or 16th century, that Cambridge emerges as a prominent center as well. And this is period which also witnessed a lot of changes in university system. We find that collegiate system, which most of Commonwealth nation although continue to follow, the foundation of this English college system was laid in during the 14th century in Chaucer's England. There were various regions, various social political regions that contribute to make England as one of the founding civilization of modern period itself. So, having lived during that period, Chaucer did enjoy a lot of this advantage, and in his writings also we see reflection of this refinement, this exposure and this increased growth that England was getting used to. Yes, but at the same time it is very important for us to note that Chaucer also lived in a century which was very eventful. Chaucer's England was not all about political stability, was not all about the flowering period of English language and literature. It was very eventful in political sense, in terms of other kinds of crisis, in terms of common life people, so on, so forth. Okay, we will take a quick look at the turn of events during Chaucer's England and how it adversely affected the progress of England in the 14th and 15th century. We find that England during that time it was quite affected by plague. Mainly we have a major plague which swept through most of Europe and Britain. It was Black Death. That was quite a tragic event to begin with and there was a continuous occurrence. In fact, Britain was under the attack of the Black Death 4 times, almost consecutively, and that had even wiped out half the population. The nation had to struggle a lot to deal with this crisis. There were also a lot of peasant rebellion because England was still under the feudal order, and that had resulted in a lot of unrest and lot of difficulties for the peasants. There were also massive corruption mainly within the Roman Catholic Church. In this context, it is useful to remember that there were a lot of monasteries that and the other institution at the Roman Catholic Church had established, and there were also breeding grounds for a lot of corruptive activities. The common man was quite upset by the many things which were happening about the luxurious life that most of the clergy were living. And the clerks who were employed within this institution were also contributing to the corruption in many different ways. And in this was also affecting the people in another sense, in the sense that there was a heavy taxation which was imposed upon them, and the taxation was quite doubled by the effect of the wars that happened. One of the major wars that will be taking look at the 100 Years' War. The war was fought with France for over 116 years. means 116 years, though it come to be known as the Hundred Years' War. And there was prevalent anarchy because of all these things put together. There were massive deaths, rebellion, corruption, war, heavy taxation. The common man was not living a life of luxury like the courtiers, but he was bearing the brunt of all these events put together. And in that sense, it was an age of glaring social contrast. As we would see, on the one hand, there was a very lavish kind of peasantry going on, on the other hand, people lived in adverse poverty. There was robust vigor and good health, lot of good things happening on the one hand. On the other hand, we had death, crippling disease, so on and so forth. On the one hand, elegant literature such as Chaucer's and many others had begun to flourish, which is seen as the beginning of English literature, but on the other, there was also widespread literacy. Here it is important to note there is some linguistic element here as well. England also had these languages such as Latin and French. As we mentioned, Latin was a language of church, of clergy, and French was the language of the courtiers. So there was very little attention, formal attention paid to English language in the beginning. But we do see that lot of concerted effort went into making English language medium of the common people, and also the church also in certain ways, especially the activities of reformation, also paved to the emergence of English as a common language, the translation by Bible into the vernacular by John Wycliffe, and more importantly, most of the leading writers of this period, including Geoffrey Chaucer, he wrote in English, making the language more, bringing the language closer to the common man as well. So coming back to our point, on the one hand, there was the emergence of elegant literature, and on the other hand, there was widespread literacy of the common people. And also this reminds us that literature and all other reading materials which was available during that period, the target audience was mainly the courtiers and the nobles and clergy, and that was very little available for the common man as such. Fourthly, on the one hand, there was this revival of religious faith which happened. It was also known as Reformation. A more detailed study of social history will take us into the specific detail of the event which swept across Europe and Britain in the 14th and 15th century, which also laid a proper cultural foundation to England, which was set to begin on a golden period from the 16th century onward. And on the other hand, there was widespread corruption in church, which was leading to a whole lot of hostility and lot of disgruntled feeling among the people. And as we mentioned earlier, the wars were contributing in tremendous ways to the general peace and general life of England in many ways. So we need to look at the Hundred Years' War, which qualifies to be one of the major sources of heavy taxation. It also heavily drained the resources of England. This makes it important for us to understand the trajectory of this war, which was spread over 116 years, a little more than 100 years, though for convenience historians have chosen to name it as a 100-year war. The origin of the context with France, it dates back to 11066 AD. If you remember, that was the Norman conquest happened. So when the William the Conqueror, who led the Norman conquest against the English, against the Anglo-Saxons and won over them, he ended up ruling England and Normandy in France together. There was the island of England on one hand and Normandy in France on the other. So all subsequent kings of England, they all successors continued to rule England and Normandy simultaneously, and it was seen as a quite rightful claims as well. Also we notice that from the time of Henry II, this lot of territorial dispute which emerge, and it also becomes a little difficult to control the land which is situated in a distant land, and also the same period the difficulty in controlling the land leads to lots of territorial dispute between England and France, leading to lot of hostile emotion as well. And if you remember, it is around the same period in the 14th or 15th century that England, the French also began to lose its prominence and loses out to English language. So lot of factors contribute to this hostility, and this becomes a triggering factor to contribute towards war-like situation as well. And what happens by the reign of Edward III is quite significant. We find that by 1327, compared to the entire land of Normandy, there were only two provinces left in France under the control of England. This is a major source of concern as the source of revenue was also getting limited, and also English kings begin to take it as a matter of prestige as a matter of honor. And around the same time, we find that in France, another turn of events are happening. So this is in France in 1328. So in 1328 in France, King Charles IV he dies and there is no heir, and Edward III is the King of England during this period. And Edward III's mother, who is Isabella happened to be Charles IV's sister. So Edward's third mother Isabella assumed that since Charles IV has died leaving no heir as successor, they assume that there is a rightful claim for Edward III. That was also should remember that he was only 15 years old then. So Edward III and his mother, they assume that there is a rightful claim for Edward III to the crown for France. So they lay a claim to English King Edward III, who happens to be the nephew of the deceased King Charles IV. He lays a claim to the crown of France, which is not taken very kindly by the French people because they had other plans in hand. And there is the rule, this rule which prevails in France, that one can become king only through their father's line and not through their mother's line. But in England, one can become king through either ways, through father's line or through mother's line. So because of this, the French people are very unhappy with Edward III accessing the crown of France. And with this, a kind of dispute emerges in France in general was against this, and they bring up new king, and the 100 Years' War we find it break out. And it was at this point of time that 100 Years' War break out between England and France. And to be noted, this was not a single series of war happening. It was not a single war which happened between England and France. In fact, it was a series of wars, series of battles which happened. And there was, in the initial period, victory was mostly on the English side, but eventually it happened so that France wins over, and even two provinces which were held by Britain, they lose out those two provinces by 1453 by the end of the war. We shall not be getting into further details of the 100 Years' War, but some of the details we shall be taking a look at again when we engage with 15th century, because a war is spread over such a long time that continued to inform the way in which social political history of Britain was formed. So coming back to our original point, due to various things happening, especially as the age was dominated by the war, generally mood of 14th century, it was not very favorable for the common man. But in spite of that, we do find that Chaucer continues to write, and he gets qualified as the father of English literature itself. So this is how we sum up the challenging period of the 13th and 14th century. There was famine, there was death, anarchy, tyranny, wars, habit accession, and you name it, and you have it. It was a challenging period for Britain, and if we just try to sum up this age, there was three major influences that shaped Chaucer's age. Chaucer's age, the three major influences that were social and political unrest, Reformation, Renaissance. So in the later videos, we will see social and political unrest, Reformation, and the Renaissance. Thank you all, dear listeners. Thank you.